we are moving to the first session of the day, which is largely connected to the first keynote lecture. And the topic of our session is Broadening Optimization of Protection. So my name is Thierry Schneider. I'm the chair of Committee 4 of ICRP and director of CPN in France. And I have the pleasure to co-chair this session with Pippa Feinstein from Nuclear Transparency Project in Canada. We have planned the session as a panel session, but with some difficulty because finally we had only 3 participants in person, and we will have 3 participants not online but remotely with pre-recorded presentation, but we discussed with them in order to get their contribution. So the objective of this session, we already discussed this question of optimization. We had yesterday a session on public exposure, so it's also connected to what we will discuss today. But the objective is really to think, first of all, of multi-actors, multi-participants, and for that we have selected some speakers who will represent industry, regulator, university, and civil society, and also some experts in radiation protection. The other aspect beyond the multiple actors, the objective is to think about public health, social, economic, environmental, and also the governance with regard to the optimization and how to implement optimization of radiological protection in different domains. So we will not cover everything, but we will try to highlight some key points. The structure of the session will be first to have an introduction of each speaker within 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will have a second part of the session dedicated to discussion with different panelists, and then we will open the floor to all the questions from the audience. So without waiting more, I would like to introduce the first speaker with John Takala. John is from Comecon in Canada and is also a member of ICRP Committee 4. So John, you have the floor.
Thank you. My talk today, I'll start us off with going over at a high level ALARA practices in the nuclear industry as I've seen them over my 3 decades and counting in industry. I'll start, you've seen a similar slide yesterday on ALARA performance. I'll talk about how we've achieved that broadly and some ongoing challenges that we have present. So similar to the slide we saw yesterday, this has the average effective dose in nuclear workers. This is from latest UNSCEAR report. And you can see this average dose going down from 4-ish millisieverts down to under a millisievert across the world as an average. Really quite a steady march downward, and I think it's a testament to the hard work over the last several decades in RP and industry. And so how's this come about? Well, I think it really starts at the design of the facility, and certainly in the Canadian context, a new facility is going to have formal dose predictions, a numerical ALARA analysis as part of the initial design and licensing. And we're not starting in a vacuum, usually meeting the dose limits with proven workplace design and practices from previous experience in facilities sets the ball for meeting ALARA and dose limits. And then there's just some very basic things. And Specific jobs, the average to maximum dose is often a factor of 3 or more, and we have to regulate to the control to the individual, not the limits aren't set on an average, but on an individual. So with that, we have to, inherently by design, keep average dose group averages to 5-ish millisieverts, and those would be the high groups, and most are much lower. So this is in the design, and then as we move and validate that with operating experience, then you've set the bar, and this is often based, of course, on past facilities. And if there was a substantive change, then we'd have to justify that with a formal ALARA justification. But once we get past that, we move into the operational phase, where you're probably not making major design changes to the facility, but ALARA continues with those field-level decisions that happen on a day-to-day basis. Gains are often made, we see, in small incremental steps, improvements in job tasks, often done at low costs and usually with efficiency gains in mind. And in this, worker involvement is a key part of the process. My experience, it's very rare to hear that workers believe their doses are too high. They may be concerned about, hey, could we make this area better? And then, or this task, can we make this task more efficient? But overall, with that engagement of the workforce, we've seen general comfort with what their doses are. And part of this is trying to cultivate a culture, what I'd say, of vigilance or a healthy respect for radiation. You see, with a new facility and a new workforce, often there's anxiety, people about radiation, but then there's a danger of to get comfortable with it. You go what we call like the valley of complacency. Oh, it's no big deal. You've got to get past that and get to that state of healthy respect and vigilance. And once sort of that, with a few years of operating experience and doses are considered ALARA, at least on a sort of macro level, it becomes hard to move the dial much on those average doses, but their then focus can be on reducing maximum doses, risk of upset conditions leading to higher doses, which might make significant improvements in the operation, but may not actually lower actual doses, but just potential doses. And the key to maintaining ALARA, I think, is a good safety culture. And I'd say there is a very strong safety culture in the nuclear industry, so management and workers are genuinely striving for the same goal, a safe workplace. But that good safety culture isn't just radiation. We have to consider the operability, maintenance, conventional safety issues, and sometimes these are aligned very well with reducing radiation doses, but sometimes they're not. And an open dialogue is needed with workers and management to keep workers engaged so everybody understands what the goal is and why we're making decisions. And then just to end the thing on the challenges, and I thought about this for a bit and thought you can be physical, programmatic, and cultural, and they're interrelated. So physical examples, aging infrastructure as a facility. You've been successful for a number of years, but like all of us, things, we don't get any younger. I listened to it with envy of people worrying about dyeing their hair. So, and new conditions, that happens. Then programmatic changes, more at a management level, losing sight of other risks, sometimes an overzealous drive to reduce doses that start introducing perceived new other risks can disengage a workforce. And then the cultural things I'd mentioned about complacency, frustrations with changes. All these are interrelated, and we have to manage these in an ongoing manner. So I just conclude that the industry, I think, has a proven history of implementing effective ALARA approaches, and just end with that clear regulatory regime and an understandable system of radiological protection, really the bedrock for industry's success in implementing it. So those clear rules and clear understanding of what we're doing is key for our success.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Well, thanks very much for that, John. Our next speaker is going to be Gillian Hirth from the ICRP Main Commission and CEO of ARPANSA in Australia.
So good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me again on this panel. I'll be, I guess, speaking about some of the regulatory expectations of optimisation in radiation protection today. But before we get started, I think I wanted to provide a bit of a background about me. Because while ARPANSA is the peak authority in Australia for radiation protection and nuclear safety, it's also a public health advisor, a service provider and a regulator of other Commonwealth entities for radiation and nuclear safety. We're the only nuclear safety regulator in Australia, but we work cooperatively with 8 states and territories in radiation safety, and we have the overarching responsibility to promote national uniformity. That has its own challenges. But in coming to being the head of a regulatory body, most of my background has actually been as an experience of being regulated. So a bit about me. I'm an environmental radiochemist, my PhD, and also my postdoc. I focused on measuring uranium series nuclides. Before joining ARPANSA, I worked at the Australian Defence Organisation, and radiation was one hazard that we were responsible for in range of a whole range of other hazardous materials and environmental management issues. When I first came to ARPANSA, I was involved in codes and standards development, so that was a sort of regulatory support function. I then moved into a senior scientist role, so I was looking at research and data that would support regulations. I did a short stint in international relations, and then I moved into radiation health services, first as the monitoring and emergency response section head, and then in 2016 I was appointed as the head of that branch, which is actually regulated. So I was a licence holder, so managing conflicts of interest of being regulated within your own organisation. And I had responsibilities there for sections who provided health advice, service delivery, and also the monitoring and emergency response, labs and networks across both ionising and non-ionising radiation, but not medical. And in March of this year, I was appointed as the CEO. So during the last 12 years at ARPANSA, I've also been quite involved in a range of other international activities. In particular with UNSCEAR, I've been involved in all of the Fukushima projects, and that has included outreach activities in Japan. And I was the chair of the committee for 3 years. I've now been involved with ICRP since 2017, first on Committee 4 and now on the Main Commission. And I've also been involved with a range of IAEA activities and committees. But there are other activities in Australia that I've been involved with that I think are quite relevant to today's discussion at the national level in Australia. I had two years on the Alligator Rivers Region Technical Committee as an independent radiation expert. RTAC is established to provide independent scientific advice across a range of disciplines to support The review and research needs management and oversight of Ranger's plans as it's progressed through operation, but now as it moves through closure, remediation, rehabilitation and restoration. And the engagement and discussions with Indigenous communities in particular has been very important in that process. I've also been involved in our Panza activities, outreach activities and visits to communities in South Australia who were potential host communities of the proposed National Radioactive Waste Management Facility to engage and talk with communities about the regulator's role, what it is, what it's not. But across all of these experiences, two things have stood out. One is the need for good independent science that underpins everything that we do and underpins our standards. But the most important has been the engagement process with public and communities, having a willingness to meet and talk and listen with all stakeholders and understand their fears and their concerns about what they may lose, and to be open and transparent in your advice and decisions. So finally, when I consider our Panza's approach to regulation, what I've learned about regulation over the last 12 years has been strongly influenced by my predecessor, Carl Magnus Larsen, who sends his regards to many of you in this room. Under Carl Magnus's leadership, he instilled at our Panza over his 12 years as the CEO that a regulator must be risk-informed, must have a people-centric approach, be firmly based on optimisation, and that you must understand the context of exposures, consider what is justified, tolerable and reasonable, and explore what is acceptable, and be independent. He upheld these principles that a regulator must ensure licensees are responsible for the radiation protection of people and the environment, and that the regulator must demonstrate integrity, transparency and openness in its assessment and decision-making processes. These are principles that I plan to uphold and carry forward for our Panza, but I also, these sorts of events are great for me. I'm what I consider to be a very junior regulator in this space. And there is so much that I can learn. And certainly, Romina, I'll be coming to speak to you about the Indigenous framework because I think there's things that Australia and Canada do have in common in that space. I'll also just quickly introduce some points on optimisation considerations for siting of a radioactive waste disposal facility. So in 2018, our Panza updated its code of practice for disposal facilities. This document hadn't been updated for a long time because it had probably not been a high priority, but with the planned new radioactive waste management facility, it was time to review this. So it was the first time that it introduced the need for an applicant to demonstrate that a proposed facility had to have a safety case and achieve a desired level of protection. During the consultation process, it identified the need for further regulatory advice, so these supporting documents. And these were advice on risk targets and dose constraints, and consultation and engagement on public health. And both of these topics relate quite strongly with optimisation of protection. So following the publication of the code in 2018, the dose and risk criteria for protection of people following the closure of a disposal facility for radioactive waste as an advisory note was published in 2020. And then during this year, the advisory note on consultation and engagement on public health and the considerations for siting, construction and operation of a radioactive waste disposal facility have been published. The value of this additional guidance is it was really about the regulator being clear about what our expectations were of licensees, but really that the public wanted to understand what these expectations were in simplified, plain language. And really that was the advisory note provides that next level of detail. So I think with that, I'll just close with this quote. That's one that Carl Magnus used a fair bit, and that's that no magic risk number can substitute for informed and thoughtful consideration by accountable officials who work with the public to make balanced decisions. It's something that's stuck with me, and I'll leave it with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Gillian, and we will come back on this element. Now we will have a pre-recorded presentation by Professor Ayagoto from Fukushima Medical University. Ayagoto is teaching epidemiology and public health, mainly for in nursing program. So if we can have the pre-recorded presentation.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to report my activities around health literacy. I will begin with how I started to work on health literacy and its concept. Then introduce our capacity building activities for professionals and children. In Japan, public health doctors like myself work with public health nurses to diagnose community using data, including health statistics. As treatment, we prescribe health policy and community activities. Health information is one of medications we prescribe. This is where I started. Right after the 2011 disaster, I analyzed child health checkup data with public health nurses. Interestingly, we found that mothers who were concerned with the differences in risk perception toward radiation among family members were more depressed compared to those who were not concerned. Here I came to learn the key concept, health literacy. It is defined as people's ability to understand and use health information to improve health. Recently, this definition has expanded to include health professionals' skills to improve people's access to health information. This is clearly explained in the U.S. Healthy People 2030 as the organizational health literacy. Health professionals as a team should equitably enable people to use health information. First of all, I studied a project to improve health professionals' skills. I adapted the U.S. health literacy training model to the Japanese language and context. There are three components. Firstly, we teach how to assess the understandability of health information. Secondly, we teach how to improve the information, followed by field practice of the learned skills. The whole workshop takes about 2 to 3 hours. We teach skills to improve sentences, graphics, and also ways to understand the intended audience, the information and health literacy needs. On the right-hand side is a little booklet I use in teaching. By the year 2019, about 25% of public health nurses in Fukushima had attended the workshop. Nearly half of the attendants used to learn skills in practice at the 1-month follow-up. They had more positive attitude toward feedback from the community residents, and their self-evaluation of risk communication competencies improved. Moreover, an assessment among the intended audience showed that older people and those without regular doctor visits were more likely to notice the improvements in health information revised by the trained nurses. So health literacy capacity building would contribute to promoting communication between professionals and the public in preventing inequity in access to health information. I keep getting requests to run the workshop for different groups. Professionals include nutritionists, school administrators, and disaster prevention officers. At universities, I teach medical and nursing students. I recently gave workshops for international students and JICA trainees from the Pacific Islands. So this health literacy workshop is crossing borders. Secondly, I moved on to plan and implement a project to increase community residents' skills. Health literacy is more than just making easy to understand information. Here's a paper explaining very simply the 3 points of communicating with the public. The third point is that a participatory approach is important in crisis communication. In my current work, I collaborate with school children. The school health project called Creative Health has 3 components. We first developed the ACT workshop, which applied the performance-based method adapted from the UK in order to withdraw children's opinions through making and acting short dramas about the place they live. We then added the topic-based body and food workshops. Our activities aim to facilitate students' scientific and creative thinking, working in teams, presenting, and expressing their opinions. The evaluation of the project at 2 schools in Fukushima showed that children appreciated presenting, measuring, learning connections between the topics they have learned, and working with peers. They perceived their health and foods in their community more positively after participating. The implementation of Creative Health Project will be expanded to Indonesia, Cambodia, and Rwanda. The picture shows the online training of the ACT workshop for Indonesian facilitators. The workshop was immediately implemented at Indonesian schools. Students enjoyed and parents were happy about their children's learning. Importantly, teachers learned to accept students' opinions and recognize their abilities. In summary, the evolution of our health literacy initiatives covers 2 arcs of health literacy. It's crossing borders and would serve as a Build Back Better model after a major crisis. Thank you for listening.
Our 4th speaker is also going to be joining us virtually and has pre-recorded a presentation. This is Nadia Zaleznik, who is the chair of the Nuclear Transparency Watch in Europe.
Good morning to everybody. My name is Nadia Zaleznik and I will shortly present the nuclear transparency role I'm chair of in nuclear safety and transparency, and that includes also radiation protection. So Nuclear Transparency Watch, with abbreviation of NTW, is a non-governmental organization based on French law from 1905, devoted to nuclear safety and transparency, organized as a network of NGOs and experts in almost all European countries. That means beyond the borders of EU. Currently, we have 55 members, organizations, and individual experts from across Europe. We built on the Aarhus Convention, and NTW works to ensure that civil society is present at the heart of expertise and decision-making on nuclear and radiation protection, safety and security in EU. The network activities cover the entire nuclear cycle, with a particular focus on the operational safety of the operating nuclear facilities, including issues like lifetime extension of old nuclear power plants, emergency preparedness and response, post-accident management, radioactive waste management, decommissioning and environmental issues which enter in parallel last year. In addition to that, we also question the transparency and follow it at the national, European and international level. We also devoted many activities, but some of the most important I will present with only very shortly. So in the area of emergency preparedness and response, we performed the assessment of the arrangements on EPR from the civil society view. That was a past project, but has large impact, providing that the current arrangements are not addressing many concerns of society, especially local inhabitants. We pointed out the topics where improvements needs to be achieved, like the planning, the whole cycle of planning, then the whole cycle of the how to, for example, provide the iodine prophylaxis, how to look at the management of the local, national, and transboundary levels, how to harmonize the emergency provisions, and what to do in case of real evacuation, especially in the large urban areas which were established later the MPPs were built. So we are doing many activities in this respect. We organized a kind of campaigns. We organized collaboration with EC, European Commission players, and we performed nuclear roundtables to improve the situation. In the radioactive waste management, we focus and we are involved in the European research program called EURAT, which is dealing with radioactive waste management. And NTW is there involved based on the participation in the program of civil society experts. So we are involved in several projects, like one dealing with the uncertainties in management of radioactive waste, or the one dealing with the management of the radioactive waste from cradle to grave. NTW also contributes with civil society and address important questions for society. For example, what questions are brought in case of shared radioactive waste solution? What lesson can be learned in the development of national radioactive waste solution for transparency? How to address the remaining uncertainties in radioactive waste management? Or how to deal with the long period of governance after the closure of radioactive waste disposal? In this context, it appeared important to take advantage of EURAT to develop within Nuclear Transparency Watch a broader reflection on the legal, scientific, social, and financial condition for a continuous, very long-term citizens' monitoring of radioactive waste management activities. We also deal with the transparency, and for example, we develop a new tool for interaction of different actors. We develop a serious game called Pathway Evaluation Process, which provides possibilities for a dialogue around the concrete topic like radioactive waste management or emergency preparedness and response or environmental legislation by different actors like civil society, regulatory authorities, responsible implementers and similar. And just recently, we established a new group called Environmental Impact, and we are dealing with the projects like open radiation, where we invite citizens to perform their own measurements of radioactivity. We are planning to do the temperature measurements on the rivers, which are connected to the nuclear power plants. And we also organize environmental impact assessment coordination for different lifetime extension of the facilities across Europe. So basically, this is what we do. And I thank you very much for the invitation, and in case there will be some question, I will try to answer in written. Thank you very much.
So the next presentation will be also pre-recorded, and this is a presentation of a tool dedicated to the implementation of ALARA, and it will be presented by Yuan Zhao from ICRP in China. So if we can have the pre-recorded presentation.
I'm glad to share with you some experience related to ALARA concept. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Zhao Yuan from China Institute for Radiation Protection. The institute was established in 1962. Since the 1980s, our institute has started the research on optimization of radiation protection. In the past 20 years, we have assisted many nuclear power plants in establishing ALARA process and organizations. Next, I will introduce our team's practice in ALARA planning tool in recent years. Radiation protection management based on visualization technology is one of the important development directions of ALARA. Some practices have been carried out, such as gamma radiation field calculation, 3D visualization, dose simulation, and so on. Based on those practices, we developed CRIP dose. This system relies on three-dimensional virtual reality technology. The intensity of radiation field can be realized by color. The overall frame is shown in the figure, including data acquisition, monitoring and simulation, information management, and decision support. The system comes by the geometric model and the radiometric model of the real world. The geometric model is derived from 3D laser scanning and design drawings. Radiation data comes from source item and on-site dose rate measurement. Source inference algorithm and improved point-corner integration technology are used to reconstruct the radiation field. The mapping relationship between dose rate and color allows the user to detect high dose rate areas quickly. The system has been applied to the Unit 1 in Qingshan nuclear power plant since December 2020. The fast calculation and visualization of radiation field are realized. We have scanned more than 1,700 effective points in this project. CRIP DOS also can present several operation plans, especially for high radiation risk operations. Based on the known radiation field, the accumulated dose in each plan is calculated. There is a repair case. The first plan is direct maintenance without any shielding. The accumulated dose is about 0.6 mSv. The second plan is to set shielding first. The total dose is about 0.55 mSv, 10% lower than the first plan. The system is also an important tool for digital management, including equipment information, radiation monitoring data, radiation work permit information, and so on. For future work, a more intelligent radiation monitoring system is needed to obtain radiation data more quickly, in real time, and in a comprehensive manner. An important tool is the wireless indoor locating EPD. The position, local dose rate, and the accumulated dose are monitored in real time.
And our final presentation is going to be from Jack Valentin, who is joining us in the room today. Jack Valentin's coming to us from Jack Valentin Radiation Protection, as well as the past scientific secretary at the ICRP.
Thank you, Chair. I now am a independent consultant with my own company, Jack Valentin Radiological Protection, and one of my major customers is the Swedish Radiation Emergency Medicine Center, which is the unit at the Karolinska Medical University. Once I've got the hang of this, which is not all that easy. Thierry, do you know where I'm supposed to press? Yeah. Sorry about that. I just wanted to take the opportunity to point out that with increasing age, I've become very hard of hearing. So in case anybody wants to talk to me about anything, please speak loudly, clearly, and very slowly. I was, as the former scientific secretary of ICRP, the editor of publication 103, the 2007 recommendations. So I may be the only person in the entire world who has read that book from page 1 to the end. And there are a number of shortcomings in the recommendations, which could be seen as my fault, since I, as editor, was unable to fix them. So in essence, my presentation is a recommendation of sorts to my successor, Chris Clement, to take a firm stand when the natives are acting up and not be perturbed if some of the main commission members become obstreperous. Anyway, what are the main problems? Well, here I will have to tread on some toes, and I hope that you will forgive me, taking into account that I'm probably the oldest person in this assembly. First of all, that's the genetic risk estimate. This estimate of the risk due to genetic effects of radiation must be sorted. In the first place, the estimate back in the 1977 recommendations was based on 2 generations only. Then in the 1990 recommendations, we extended the estimate to cover genetic equilibrium, i.e. we went for what you might regard as an infinite risk integral. But then in 2007, ICRP returned to an estimate of just 2 generations, and I think from a credibility and psychology point of view, that was a mistake. Another problem is that the explanations of the genetic risk are incomprehensible. My own background is as a PhD in population genetics, and I cannot understand what it says or how the calculations were performed. And I think that shows that the transparency is not acceptable. Another problem is that I think ICRP needs to return to its 1920s roots and take account of the probability of some people being seriously exposed in accidents, in nuclear explosions, and so forth. And here I can say that we've provided some of the legwork already for ICRP. I have initiated, and together with my Karolinska colleagues, edited a special issue of the Journal of Radiological Protection on medical management of patients after high doses of ionizing radiation. And in a parallel but not related effort, Janat Kaur of WHO has compiled a special issue of Environmental Advances on Radiation Emergency Preparedness and Response. And I think these two documents should provide enough material for an ICRP task group. I think it's important that ICRP doesn't for the fourth time repeat the mistake of publishing its dose coefficients many years after the recommendations to which they pertain. This is not a criticism of the hard-working experts of Committee 2. It's a criticism of the main commission for not waiting until they have all the building blocks which are required. There's also an information aspect here. A communication aspect. It's important that those coefficient compilations highlight only the major changes and don't provide all the minute details, because these will be, unfortunately, easily misused by silly regulators. I also think it's important to look at repeated exposures of patients. And I am aware, of course, of the many papers by Colin Martin which state that this is not important. I think he makes a serious mistake. He's basing his results on doses to patients in the United Kingdom. And as it happens, the United Kingdom probably has the best medical radiological protection in the entire world. So I don't think the data from the UK are representative. We are all very happy that we have publication 138, which is very important. However, it treats the theoretical philosophy of ethics rather grudgingly, and the core values that form the basis of publication 138 simply just say, you must be nice, you must behave in a good way. And that is true, but it doesn't really help when we have conflicts in ethics. And I think we need practical examples of ethical assessments also for other areas than medical ethics, which we heard yesterday will be addressed. I think everybody knows about Roger Coates' very convincing derision of clearance values. But when we fix that problem, we mustn't at the same time throw away achievements in radiological protection. And I wish to remind you that there's no possibility of optimizing too much, because if protection costs too much, then the protection is not optimized. Having been raised in the very utilitarian atmosphere of Boulindel, I know that he would always say, if it doesn't cost any, it's worth doing if it can save a statistical life. And this is an opinion that I share. And the problem really is worse with spent fuel, where lots of resources are spent on absurd overprotection. And I would say that so many of us have invested, even within this community, in this overprotection that it will be very hard to go back on this waste on waste, if you wish. Also, there are some good old ideas which emerged about 50 years ago from the National Radiological Protection Board, which happened to be an organization which was evaluated internationally and regarded as the best organization of its kind in the entire world. And 1 year later, the British government had eradicated NRPB. I think that's an interesting story there. Anyway, one of their ideas was to give greater weight to relatively high doses, and another was to give greater weight to doses incurred now rather in the far future. And I think both of these can be defended and ethically motivated. Finally, I think ICRP should extend its remit. The worst mistake ever by ICRP was when WHO asked ICRP, could you please start working with non-ionizing radiation? And ICRP said, no, F off. And ICNAP is a brilliant organization, but I think both for the customers and for ICNUP experts, it might be very useful if we could merge our organizations. And on a similar note, IAEA has initiated INSAG in order to mimic ICRP for safety and security. But of course, INSAG is a failure, both because it's not an independent organization like ICRP, and because INSAG is not very effective. So I think, again, there's a case for a merger there. And finally, I would recommend that ICRP also starts a committee on the general regulatory science and philosophy, because nobody else does that, so that would be very helpful. If ICRP listens to these ideas, then I think we can look forward towards some interesting recommendations. Thank you for your interest.
So thank you very much, Jack, and thank you to all the speakers for very interesting and concise presentations. Before we turn to questions from the floor, Thierry and I have actually developed a couple questions of our own that we'd like to put to the speakers quickly. The first relates to themes that President Velshi noted in her address this morning, as well as the panels yesterday on ethics and public communication. And this is the fact that, or it relates to the fact that implementing ALARA in practice can be a contentious process. There have been some recent examples of these in various jurisdictions. One of them concerns the reference man model for determining public doses used by US regulators. And there we've seen women's organizations and feminist organizing talking about how maybe a reference woman example might better protect women and birthing people. We also saw how indigenous people have been organizing to also propose alternatives to the reference man, talking about the need to protect indigenous people who live off the land in their homelands, and in particular, again, indigenous women and birthing people living off the land. In my own jurisdiction, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's recently released Reg Doc 2.9.2, which provides guidance on ways in which releases from nuclear facilities can better take into consideration the needs of various ecosystem components, in particular aquatic biota, and that is a relatively new or revised approach to regulating releases that doesn't just rely on human doses, which was more prevalent in the past. And additionally, in Japan, criteria used to determine Fukushima Daiichi evacuees' ability to return to their hometowns is a series of criteria that's become quite contentious in that context. So we'd like to turn it over to panelists to talk a little bit about how some of these local negotiations happen on the ground, and to ask them to provide some of their professional insights on how industry or regulators, as well as civil society organizations and other practitioners, radiation protection practitioners, can weigh in on these important debates. John, would you like to begin?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, there's quite a bit in there. I'd say the reference man, woman, people. There's lots. There's the balance. I think we heard some of the complexity in the system, and scientific completeness and understandability. So there's a balance in how that is achieved. The environmental doses, I think in that regard, I'd say that in Canada we've been doing that for several decades. And there's been sort of an ongoing evolution. The reg doc being referenced, I think, is the just latest regulatory step. I know in the EIS, as I was involved in the 90s, we had to do dose calculations for the biota and explain the impacts to that, along with chemicals impacts, and that's been incorporated into the licensing process for the last 20 years, but it continues to evolve. And the ALARA process, and I'd say often I'm working with workers, and with workers and communities, the communications are quite different. With the workers, you've got, I think, a higher level of understanding of the issues. They tend to be very practically oriented. And then with the communities, it's a much more diverse, and I think President Velche's example of the Bruce Power steam generator shipment wasn't so much an ALARA discussion per se, because the numbers don't really matter. You could say 20 microsieverts, 20 nanosieverts, 20 picosieverts. I think the reaction would have been probably the same. The issues are just at a very fundamental, is it safe? Is this necessary? Why are you doing this? What are the benefits? So the discussions on many of these issues aren't ALARA optimization as we think of them. I think they're often, with the public, much broader and more difficult.
Thank you. Gillian.
Again, where to start? Whether you use reference man or reference woman, or reference child, I think a lot of the time it comes down to the uncertainties, and have a reference person, and maybe there's a screening level, and then above a certain level, taking into account the uncertainties that might be around a reference person, you then do more detailed examination if it's warranted. I guess that's potentially looking at the environmental side of things, where you do have screening levels, and then you look at more detail with absolute representative organisms or representative people of that area, whereby you might need more detailed information and can take into account Indigenous activities. In considering I think the the areas of engagement with communities, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I think it's always very clear for regulatory agencies to be clear about their expectations and what factors need to be taken into consideration. But when sitting down with communities, having that opportunity for dialogue, and so everybody understands what needs to be taken into account. The issues that we've seen in Australia is probably one where the engagement with communities, and if they haven't been provided with an opportunity to participate in the discussions and deliberations at an early stage, to inform the decision-making process, it's their lack of engagement at an early stage is when the science and the underpinning information becomes irrelevant You know, I've had people say, I'm not actually concerned about the risk. I'm concerned about the fact that we weren't engaged and community wasn't defined and the parameters for a decision-making process weren't articulated at an early point in time. So I think really making sure that you have that ethical approach to how you do your regulatory assessments and how operators, particularly with siting, determine a location and that process, and that it shouldn't be bounded by a time frame. It should take as long as it's as necessary. I think experience from Australia and being bound by political cycles has also been, you know, those external factors. I think I'll leave it there.
Jack?
Thank you. I don't perceive Swedish ALARA discussions as tense, but then I'm probably biased, and I have neither the competence nor the authority to provide an, quote, official, unquote, view of Swedish public perception of ALARA and its conflicts. But my personal opinion would be on the issue of sex-dependent risk, that it must be taken into account. For practical and ethical reasons, it's obvious that we cannot have sex-specific standards. Instead, the standards have to be adapted to the highest risk level, the risk level of the more sensitive sex. As for environmental protection, that has been part of Swedish radiation legislation for decades, so that is not a problem that I recognize. As for sustainability, we're all interested in that, and while the present political climate in Sweden is strongly in favor of new build for sustainability, of course the anti-nuclear movement calls in question whether nuclear should be called sustainable. But it's important to understand that the debate is not in any way as adversarial as it is in, for instance, the United States or in Germany. People from different camps are able to meet and talk to each other in a manner which couldn't happen in the United States. And I can just say that one of the top echelon guys from Greenpeace was recruited by the Swedish nuclear industry and then went on to the regulator, and is appreciated in all camps.
Thank you. I just would like to highlight some elements provided by Professor Ayagoto from Fukushima Medical University on this topic. She insisted on the fact that the radiation recommendations have to be discussed and are made on communication, and this is not something that people are ordered to follow. And then when she is teaching with nursing student biostatistics and epidemiology, she allows them to redo the calculation, to understand and to discuss the meaning of the risk, and notably based on the data on radiation level in Fukushima. And then what she observed is that at the end, the discussion allows the student to discuss the possibility to live in Fukushima area, and the reason to have informed the situation with regard to that, and also to address this sensitive issue of genetic effect due to the risk calculation, and that they consider that the genetic effect is unlikely due to the scientific data. And then the last point that she mentioned with regard to that is the importance for the health professional to develop some skill to be able to empower the people when they engage in communication, in order not to be something where you declare something, but really to be able to have an accessible way on scientific information based on the local circumstances.
Thank you, and I'll share some notes that Nadia sent with us also in writing on this question. Here, Nadia was talking about Nuclear Transparency Watch's work on safety and transparency, and she noted that radiation protection is an important part of this. She explained that the organization is engaged in several related activities, and this is how they sort of weigh in on these questions of ALARA and acceptability. The first way is that they participate in regulatory processes. For them, this is environmental impact assessments for life extensions of existing nuclear power plants, as well as processes to consider new nuclear facilities like the Deep Geological Repository in Finland. Here, Nuclear Transparency Watch performs evaluations of available documents and points to potential shortcomings in them, including those related to doses, but also the correctness of certain calculations that are made. And here she underscores how civil society organizations have relevant expertise to assist and improve decision-making processes substantively. She also highlighted another area in which nuclear transparency does its work. One of them is in relation to monitoring and environmental monitoring. So they have an open radiation project where they encourage members of the public, but especially younger generations and school students, to go out and do radiation measurements in their local communities. And through this, they are able to develop a greater understanding of the nature of radiation, as well as perform independent measurements and assess the situation around nuclear facilities that are in their communities. This also empowers them to be able to question operators if needed in certain circumstances. And the organization's beginning a new project where they're going out to measure water temperatures around certain nuclear power plants in Europe, where existing data isn't always trusted by local communities. The final example of Nuclear Transparency Watch's interventions relates to the performance evaluations they do of regulators across Europe looking to evaluate their relative independence. Here, Nuclear Transparency Watch also works with supporting whistleblowers in jurisdictions where they require it. And all of these sort of underscore the emphasis that Nuclear Transparency Watch places in building the capacity of local communities to be able to engage more with both regulators as well as industry in their communities in order to take independent positions on nuclear issues.
Thank you. I think it's time now to open the floor for discussion. So I see some people who are ready to ask questions. So you can start.
Great, thank you very much.
We can't hear you. So sorry, we have
Thank
difficulty.
you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Mary Duarte. I'm the Director of RAD Safety for Ontario Power Generation. And I have a couple of comments directed to John's presentation on ALARA practices in the nuclear industry. And so John noted a number of challenges, I think very valid. I would add an important challenge, John, along the lines of changing conditions and how those factors can impact ALARA plans, and the necessity to really have rigorous controls in place to prevent unplanned exposures to workers. So that would be a comment that I would add. Also, by way of listing an opportunity, and as we saw in the presentation from China, I think innovative solutions really present a fantastic opportunity to better manage ALARA through systems such as remote monitoring, etc. So those 2 points I'd like to add. Do you have any feedback, John?
No, I think that change, whether it's sort of, I flagged on sort of the aging infrastructure, the idea that things, the success of the past, things get more difficult sometimes, but more acute changes in a particular task, and then when there's change or an incident, can stress the workforce in terms of why'd that happen. Anything associated, change is difficult, whether planned or unplanned, and that is a we see that continuously with the workforce.
Yeah, especially relevant, John, in terms of refurbishments that we are doing across the industry, where radiological changing conditions can have that impact. So important to keep that as an important consideration on ALARA. Thank you.
Thank you. You continue, and then Andy.
I'm Megan McDonald with the University of Calgary. Seeing the title, Broadening Optimization of Protection, as you see, the title doesn't have radiation there, and one of the things that I see with ALARA, the definition itself does not add in taking other risks into account. It talks about, right, reasonably achievable socioeconomic factors, but it doesn't say also including other risks and the associated risks. So actually this is a question for John. Do you have an example where optimizing, for reasonably achievable in radiation protection has come in conflict with now increasing risk to other factors that have, now we're pursuing more and more optimization, but it has actually caused other increase in risk in other areas?
Yeah, we do have to factor that in. So say a simple example might be where workers are in a tight space. They've got, and of course, a health physics person wants more data. Can you put on this better DRD? Can you put on this dust pump that's got a battery on in there? And, and of course, it's got to be in the breathing zone and all this. And so we want this data to make sure the job's safe, and the workers are getting a bit grumpy about all this gear we're putting on them that's getting in the way. So, that's a very simple example, but we have to work through that, and sometimes we can work with them to figure out. But it's non-trivial in that if they're in tight spaces and that, it, can slow them down, which may make for a higher radiation dose, but also introduce some conventional safety issues. So we have to work through those on essentially a case-by-case basis.
I don't know, Gillian or Jack, you want to add something? No? Okay, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Thierry. Andy Mail from the Environment Agency in England and ICRP Committee 4. First of all, a comment. This conversation reminds me of a quote from Groucho Marx, who said, "We have our principles, and if you don't like them, we have others." So, always important to remember. But more seriously, it appears that the optimization principle is sound in principle. But we've heard clearly that there are issues surrounding its application. And those issues are different, I guess, between whether it's a worker exposure situation or a medical exposure or public exposure. Those three situations arise or give rise to different problems with the application of the principle. So my question to the panel is, and it's similar to the previous question actually, is that there are issues to address in terms of the application of the principle, but does the panel believe that the principle itself needs redefining to make it easier to understand and easier to apply?
Who want to start? Jack, you start?
I don't quite know. Can you translate the question into English for the man who doesn't hear anything?
That was with regard. Oh, you want to repeat, Andy?
I'll try my best English. Do you believe that the optimization principle needs redefining to make it easier to apply and easier to understand?
Well, that sounds like an interesting and useful task, but I don't know who will manage to do it.
Okay. Do you want to add some, Gillian?
I don't think its definition at the moment needs too much change. The previous question about taking into account other risks, I do think that could be something that could be, or balanced with other risks, could be something that is articulated more clearly. I think back to the presentation I gave on Monday around norm, where an all hazards approach, well, what do we mean by all hazards? So maybe that's something that could be spelt out more clearly. I wasn't going to, just reflecting on ALARA and different scenarios. I remember a story of one of the South African regulators, and they were really pleased with themselves because they'd got the doses for their miners from 150 millisieverts down to 50 millisieverts per year. And they were operating at depth, so they had to balance radon exposure and heat. So having not as high air exchange in order to use air conditioning. So they were the two things. Heat exhaustion or radon exposure were the two risks that they had to offset. And they could get it to 50 millisieverts, and they were really pleased about it. But they weren't going to close the mine because of the societal and economic benefits in keeping the mine open. You know, I think that for me is a story of where you do balance real risks in order to keep a society function. He also said if he closed the mine, he would probably end up 5 kilometres below if you put that workforce out of a job.
I think I'd go more in terms of the process of the communication, and it's not so much the definition, but that need for that ongoing dialogue and understanding, whether it's with the workforce or the community. I think of a simple ALARA example on the social and economic considerations. We had a work area at one of our facilities. Guys had to go in there to repair pumps, and it was a posted area. It was high. They came out with a shielding plan to shield the source, but it wasn't cheap. And when we looked at the actual time and the dose saved and any reasonable dollar for ALARA, it was at best a pretty marginal case, but we still went ahead and funded it more on the engagement with the workforce. They'd taken this upon themselves. Some guys had designed it up, and we thought, well, we'll reduce doses if we don't fund this because they seem very keen on it, we'd be sending the wrong message. So that was an example of something going sort of the other way on the social consideration, which we felt was more important than just the hard-nosed economics of it. But if somebody from the health physics department had proposed it and we'd have done the numbers and probably said, nah, we wouldn't fund it.
Thank you. Next question, John?
Carol Robinson from the Norwegian Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority. Partly in response to some things that Jack said. And it is really, to what extent is broadening the optimization of protection the job of ICRP, and how much is it that ICRP really have to learn to play better with others? So actually communicate with other organizations, but I'm thinking particularly in terms of the environmental protection area. So I invite the panel to provide some input onto that.
Carol, I've heard you shouting at many other meetings.
particularly, I was particularly concerned, the background to why I mentioned Jack in particular was the suggesting that ICRP should also deal with nuclear safety, security, also non-ionizing radiation. I think it's important that ICRP and we all, the radiation protection community, understands our place in the overall context of decision making. And particularly my particular interest is more in the protection of the public and the environment. And in that place, we are talking about, we have to find a way, a middle way of trying to make things more comprehensible, but also trying to broaden and take account of different types of inputs in decision making. But not all of those can be done by radiation protection people. Many of those need other sorts of inputs, other sorts of technical inputs, including, and on top of that, there are all the stakeholder and public engagement and everything, but there are other technical inputs that are needed that are beyond what ICRP can do, or we in the radiation protection community can do, in my opinion. So I just wondered whether or not, to the extent, I would like some feeling from you, how much you think ICRP can do, and how much it is actually better that we have to set up better relationships with other organizations that can deal with some of these other factors.
I don't know that I will be answering your question, but I still think an important start is to begin by asking in people from other communities, like those who are negative to nuclear, for instance, and say, here's what we want to do. We wish to check how many lives we can save and what it costs, and what do you think about these questions? And once we've started that conversation, I think we can be on the right way.
Some other point of view?
I'll pick up on Carol's point about whether, in bringing in non-ionising radiation safety security. I think ICRP needs to focus on our current remit around ionising radiation and get that as good as possible. And I think the process that we're on at the moment in reviewing the recommendations is about not changing the system, but strengthening and making the system clearer. And I think that's important to continue. One of the areas that I think ICRP can consider how they articulate, and that's in relation to sustainability and the UN goals. I think about Romina's story about the boiling water and how much, was it steel that didn't get recycled? So what happened to that steel? And how sustainable is that if we're not recycling it? And closing the loop on these things. I know in Australia we have decommissioning issues coming up, and we have materials that will be part of that decommissioning that can be recycled, and that's about sustainability. And whilst being a regulator, not being a proponent for any form of generation of energy over another, I think if you're doing comparisons of whether nuclear should be used in comparison to coal or gas or wind or solar, you need to consider the whole life cycle management and the sustainability in the long term of all of those things. Yes, they might have a green outcome, but what has to be mined, what has to be processed? And I think about the UNSCI 2016 report on the comparison of different energy generation pathways and the radiation exposures that result from those. And coal is always linked to the climate change, but it's never linked to radiation issues, yet it's a massive contribution to radiation dose. If you look at environmental habitat destruction and compare some of the other solar and wind, what are the consequences? And maybe that's where
I don't know if ICRP has a role to play in that, but at least maybe we should be pointing people in the discussion that in their decisions, weighing up these different options is something that needs to be considered.
John?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, in my day-to-day job, radiation was one part of director of safety, health, environment, quality, management systems under my scope. And with management, there's a healthy debate on all these factors when we're trying to do things. But whether that would work, I think at the ICRP level, I think I'd be more inclined to, as Gillian said, keep our current remit very focused on that and consult with other expert organizations, recognizing in our recommendations that radiation is one of the considerations and in some cases not the dominant one.
Thank you. So the last question will be asked during the break. We have seen that broadening optimization is not so simple. We have to continue to work on that. And before to close, I would like to give the floor to my co-chair to give some few words of conclusion.
Thank you, Thierry. I'll keep it really short. Like my co-chair mentioned, there are lots of moving parts in this particular area. And I think something that came out of the talk for me in this panel, but in others as well, is considerations of who's at the table and what relative influence or power can they have in these kinds of discussions to ensure that diverse needs are being meaningfully addressed. And as well, to whose benefit are these decisions ultimately happening, and for whom, by whom? I think these are all themes that came out and will continue to guide further discussion. So thank you everyone for your time and interesting input.
Thank you.